American History, Chapter 15, Section 5. The Union is severed. We're going to be talking about the Republican Party, Lincoln's victory, the South voting to secede from the Union, the Confederacy forming, the days of crisis, and on to Abraham Lincoln. So you can see there in the picture here what the issue is, dividing the country between the North and the South. The election of 1860. This election was probably one of the most fiery elections in history because it was dealing with a moral issue, the moral issue of slavery. The Democratic Party, up until this time, had controlled the Union. Presidents such as President Buchanan and President Pierce, Zachary Taylor, even these presidents had actually not dealt with the issue of slavery and in many ways were pro-slavery in their presidency. The Northern Democrats had held back at this time, though, because they didn't accept this Dred Scott case. Do you remember the Dred Scott case? Basically, Dred Scott was a slave, which his slave owners had brought him into the North, and he had lived in the North with his slave owner, and his slave owner died. Well, since he was in a free state, such as Wisconsin and Illinois, that Dred Scott felt that he should be free. And so he sued the case to say that he would be able to be a free man instead, since he was living in the North. Well, the Dred Scott case did not rule that. It basically, first of all, ruled that Dred Scott could not sue the United States because he wasn't a citizen. And also, he was a slave. He was a property of the slave owner's family. And so a lot of Democrats and Republicans and a lot of people thought the Dred Scott case was dreadful, I should say, was a terrible, terrible ruling, and basically saying even if you were in the North, remember the Missouri Compromise, it said the northern states above that latitude would be free. So it was basically disregarding the Missouri Compromise, which was pretty important. So, some of the Northern Democrats even joined the Republican Party because what? The Republican Party stood up against the spread of slavery. But slavery also split the Democratic Party and totally split the Democratic convention. And so the Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. We already heard about, Lincoln and Douglas debates, right, between these two guys, Lincoln and Douglas. And so they nominated, the Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas. That's Stephen Douglas. The Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge here of Kentucky, and he was definitely pro-slavery. The Republican Party convention in Chicago, and they opposed the extension of slavery in the territories, and they chose candidate Abraham Lincoln. And it took a while before they had several ballots over and over until they finally did choose Lincoln, which took a while. So it wasn't like Lincoln was their most favorite unanimous candidate, but he was chosen. So here's a picture. Abraham Lincoln, Republican, from Illinois. His platform, slavery must not be allowed in the territories. Stephen Douglas was a Northern Democrat, not Republican, Democrat, and he was from Illinois too. And his platform was popular sovereignty, which made the states and the people actually vote to decide on the issue of slavery in the states, right? And so when the territories became states, the people should decide. So that's Douglas, Democrat in the blue, red Republican, Lincoln. And then we had a Republican, John Bell, and he's going to be in this new party called the Constitutional Unionist Party from Tennessee. And his platform was the federal government should support slavery, but also defend the Union. So he was like basically saying the southern states could not withdraw from the Union, right? But he was also supporting slavery. So And then, of course, John Breckinridge was a Southern Democrat from Kentucky, and he said the federal government must protect slavery. So those were the candidates. Again, that new party, the Constitutional Party, and that was the new minor party in 1860 that I just talked about, with John Bell from Tennessee. And he didn't mention slavery, although he actually was a pro-slavery from Tennessee, but he's just supported the one issue. He supported that the Union should stay a union, and he believed in the Constitution, and he believed in laws of the United States of America. So this was the new party. So which actually split in the Republican Party. So it split all four of these. So basically now we had parties splitting, but Lincoln ultimately would win the victory in 1860. The four different candidates. From the north, we had Lincoln, Bell, and Douglas, and in the south, Breckinridge and Douglas. Although Douglas was a northern, he was from Illinois, he's still a lot of the South, because he believed in popular sovereignty. A lot of the South would support Douglas too, but it would break the popular vote up, and none of the candidates would win a majority popular vote at all. So they had to win so much of the popular vote, but Lincoln carried the entire North and the entire West. And he also had a majority of the electoral votes, 180 of the electoral votes to 123 for all the other candidates. So here's a picture. So he had 180 votes here with electoral votes, and all these candidates here we see, all the three other candidates were divided up. So Lincoln did win as the first Republican president in the United States of America. Lincoln won. Now we had John Fremont already running as the first Republican running, but Lincoln was the first to win the presidency, to be voted president as a Republican. So, and we're not talking about the Republican Democrats back in Thomas Jefferson's time at all. We're talking about a total new party called the Republican Party, which is the Republican Party today too. So Lincoln became the first Republican president. Wow, this would cause a big uproar in the South, because they knew what Lincoln stood for, that he was against slavery. So South Carolina voted to secede from the Union. The word reached the South that Lincoln had won. They had already made plans, in fact, what would happen if Lincoln would win. Now the Republicans had control, and this would threaten their way of life, they knew. So the states in the South started to vote to secede from the Union. First of all, it would center on South Carolina. And South Carolina called a special convention together on December 20th, 1860, and they unanimously adopted the Ordinance of Secession, saying the state of South Carolina had resumed their position among the nations. So South Carolina would become its own nation. Oh boy, this would begin a lot of problems. Now knowing that South Carolina is succeeding, would other states follow South Carolina? So here we have the picture. The independence was declared of South Carolina on December 20th, 1860. And they already had planned, the South had planned on what they were going to do if they had to go to war. So other southern states would follow to secede from the Union also. First of all, in Georgia, Alexander Stephens tried to wait in Georgia to see what would happen. Would the North become hostile? Would they declare war? He wanted to see what would happen at first. But on February 1st, 1861, Southern conventions were in the states of Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and even Texas. So those states, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they had already voted to secede from the Union: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Jefferson Davis, who would later become the president of the the Confederacy, I should say, he lived 1808 to 1889, and he was from Mississippi. He said, now he was actually a senator in Congress, but he said, "I feel no hostility, but we must part. This may bring disaster on every portion of the country, but we must put our trust in God." Was Jefferson Davis really standing up for God? I don't know. We don't really know his heart, but he would become that first president of the Confederacy against the Union of the United States, and also, pro-slavery. Here's a picture of what would happen next: the North and the South going to war, the Civil War. So let's talk about this Confederacy. Well, on February 1861, all of these succeeding states that succeeded the Union, except for Texas, they got together at a convention in Montgomery, Alabama. And their convention was to organize the Confederacy. The president again would be Jefferson Davis, and he would be chosen as the president of the Confederacy. And Alexander Stephens, who I mentioned before, of Georgia, would be the vice president. Here's a picture of them, of Jefferson Davis and Stephens of Georgia, being that president and vice president of the Confederacy. And they decided to develop their own constitution for the Confederate States of America. And they patterned their constitution after the United States Constitution, but they put in their Southern viewpoint in their constitution. So here's a picture of the flag, the Confederate flag. Here's a picture of them getting together for the Confederacy in the South, a picture of the South. And you can see how the Confederacy now, they were going to be their own country, succeeding from the United States. The Confederate States of America, they would call themselves. They would be sovereign. They said they'd be sovereign, independent character of individual states. So they were saying, basically in the South, they believed each state was like their own little nation, more than a whole, developing as a whole together, but they wanted to develop the character of each one of their states. And slavery would be protected, although they did say foreign slavery trade would be prohibited. So they're not allowed to do foreign trade outside of their country. But they protected slavery. They also went against the protective tariff, which the South had always been against the tariffs. So that was prohibited so that their economy could flourish, especially in cotton, in the export of cotton. So they would not have tariffs, which they didn't like anyway. And the South had already started taking over federal property in the area. Property that was owned by the United States in the South, that the South had already made an issue that they were going to take over this property, and had started taking over these areas and that belonged to the federal government, right? And so they took over forts, they took over arsenals where ammunition and guns were kept. They took over the custom houses, the tax houses. They took over post offices, and they even took over the New Orleans Mint, where there was 500,000 worth of gold. They took over the mint. They had already taken these steps, and even steps to raise an army. They had already started raising an army. All of this happened before Lincoln was even inaugurated. So they would just had plans that this would happen and that their plans would go in. They already anticipated Lincoln becoming president and what they would do. The days of crisis. Well, President Buchanan was the 15th president before Lincoln, right? Well, he knew things were happening, and he knew there was a chance of crisis, but he took little action to ward off any crisis. In fact, first of all, he insisted the states had no right to succeed the Union. He said, The states need to, you cannot just succeed the Union because you want your way. So he wasn't into succession. But he also said that Congress had no right to make these states stay in the Union. So if the states wanted to succeed, well, Congress had no rights to make them stay. So that was a very ambivalent decision, basically saying they have no right to succeed, but Congress has no right to make them stay. And later, he did set apart the day, January 4th, 1861, for a day of prayer because he knew what would happen. He knew that we were on the edge of war. That he said, the hour of calamity and peril, to whom shall we resort for relief? He's basically saying the hour of calamity is going to come, so we must go to who? Well, we know to go to God for relief. So that's what Buchanan said. And attempts had already been made for compromise. We'll find some of these attempts at the last minute, but still none of them go through. And if you look at Buchanan, President Buchanan, you see his life here. He was a Democrat, but he had a kind of a bad background. He was expelled from college for bad conduct and later allowed to return. He was never married. His niece served as the hostess, and he actually had supported the events that had happened, the Dred Scott decision and the slavery debates and all these things doing Buchanan, but he had done little compared to what Abraham Lincoln would do. So President Buchanan is not considered one of the top presidents of the United States, indeed. But last-minute compromises would happen. Some Northerners, like the New York Tribune publisher Horace Greeley, here's a picture of him here, he would say, if the Southern states want to succeed, maybe we should just allow them to succeed peacefully. Why did he say that? Being a Northerner and a Republican, because he really did not want to go to war, right? But most people believed that no state had the right to succeed the Union. That would be considered treason if a state decided to succeed the Union. But Senator John J. Crittenden, he was of Kentucky right here, he would try to compromise because he said, well, let's all go back to the old idea. Let's go back to the 36-30 line, the Missouri Compromise, the Mason-Dixon line. Let's go back to that line and latitude and just that there's going to be no slavery in the northern of the line, no slavery, and no slavery above this line, and slavery can be below this line. Let's just do that. Let's just go back to the old stuff. Yeah, but this was unacceptable in Congress. They already had gone through this, and they knew that they could not, basically going back to that would not work. So the Crittenden Compromise was unacceptable. On February 4th, 1861, a peace convention met in Washington, D.C. to try to make peace, and a bunch of compromises were proposed, but every single one of them was rejected. At Lincoln's inauguration on March 4th, 1861, he would indeed become the 16th President of the United States, and his address was a plea for national unity. He was kind to the South. He was kind. He wanted to have their rights protected. He said, I have no purpose to interfere directly or indirectly with slavery where it already exists. Although we find later on he will emancipate the slaves. But at this point, he says he wanted slowly for this to happen and the states to stay firm in the Union. He was very firm to enforce all of federal laws in all the states and to keep possession of all these federal properties and to collect revenues. So he knew that the South was already taking over federal property, taking over arsenals, taking over forts, taking over the mint. He knew these things were going on, and he said he's going to keep possession of all these federal properties. So right there, he was declaring a type of war, right? But he appealed to the South for peace. Abraham Lincoln, of course, he lived 1809 to 1865. Just a few things about him. So he led the nation. He would be the president to lead the nation through our darkest moment, the Civil War. His life illustrated qualities to make America great indeed. He was a very diligent and hard-working individual and had much integrity. Also, he was a distinguished lawyer and a distinguished statesman. He respected others' opinions and he respected other religious beliefs, but he valued the Bible. When I say that too, when I was reading Lincoln's memoirs, as you go in, you find out that he really didn't become a born-again Christian until he came in to Gettysburg to give his Gettysburg address. He said that he had this divine moment with God where he totally accepted Jesus as his Lord and Savior and was born of the Spirit. He even says that, and that happened later on. Even though he had a lot of integrity before this time, we know after this time, he definitely was standing up for the Bible and standing up for knowing the Lord Jesus. From Gettysburg. We'll go into the Civil War and talk about Gettysburg and his Gettysburg Address later. His character, values, and beliefs shaped his policy during the war. His big determination was to preserve the Union as a whole. We see here Lincoln. Here's Lincoln's family. As you see, this is his son. He actually lost his son, which was very heartache during the presidency, and his wife, his family. And he says, America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, we will because we destroyed ourselves. Abraham Lincoln. Suspension of habeas corpus. Well, what is that? Well, habeas corpus, to keep control of the border states, Lincoln enacted the suspension of habeas corpus, and that was to detain a person that the government felt threatened by. Here we have a picture here. The writ of habeas corpus are persons' right not to be imprisoned unless charged with a crime or a given trial. So basically he said, if, he knew that someone was coming against, the Union of the United States as a Confederate, he basically now could imprison them without giving them a trial first, right? So he did that first because he knew this unlawful, indefinite imprisonment would take time. So now there would be thousands of political prisoners because anyone that was in support of the South would be able to be taken in as a prisoner of the United States. So martial law actually would happen during this time. The citizens would be tried in military tribunals rather than in civilian tribunals if they were on the basis of standing up against the Union of the United States. So the suspension of habeas corpus had belonged to Congress prior to this time, but in 1863, not too long later, Congress was resolved and giving the president this power because they knew that the president needed to have this power in midst to be able to support the United States government. So Lincoln suspended these common rights in an effort to stop anyone from supporting the Confederate cause and to prevent those who encouraged others to resist the draft, conscription. So it was important. The suspension of habeas corpus was the result of draft riots. So basically people in the midst of that would have draft riots, which would happen in the northern areas that did not want to go to war. So this is craziness that's going to happen, huh? Then in 1863, he would proclaim his famous Emancipation Proclamation of the United States. Lincoln knew slavery was wrong and he abhorred the practice. Previously, he had made no legal justification to change the law. He never said he was going to change the law on slavery, but in 1863, he decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation of the slaves. And this motive would be political, but it would also be moral because he knew slavery was morally wrong. He was made to keep the European powers from involving in the supporting of the South. So the Emancipation Proclamation had some political ramifications. First of all, now as the world looked on, they would see what this fight is about, right? And they'd be iffy in supporting the South, especially in support of slavery. It also allowed the Black Americans to be free and to enlist in the Northern Army, right? And a lot of them did. And so he was very resolved to preserve the Union in the midst of all this. But the Emancipation Proclamation would be the most famous thing in history. First of all, that Lincoln did, but one of the most famous documents of all American history. Henceforth shall free all slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. January 1st, 1863, this proclamation would become permanent. Lincoln's resolved. So Lincoln resolved to preserve the Union at all cost, right? But later on we'll find, of course we know Lincoln gets assassinated, so he'll never have the chance to see the South restored. But he became an American hero. Lincoln's unyielding persistence guided the nation through the greatest crisis of history of the nation and put the Union on the road to Reconstruction. So a few things he said here. We the people are the righteous masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution. So he was very much in supporting the Constitution. And here's, those who would deny freedom to others deserve it not from themselves. So he believed in free people, free from slavery. Here's what he wrote here, very famous, August 22nd, 1862. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. So his heart was to save the Union and bring freedom to all men. So now what happens? We're going on to chapter 16. And of course, our darkest time in history would be that bloody Civil War. And we'll see why. We'll go over the battles. But we paid dearly. United States of America paid dearly with the lives of many young men that stood out to fight in this war. Some standing and fighting against slavery, others just fighting for their families and their way of life. And so we'll see what will happen through this war and go over each part of this war, most of it very bloody in nature. So it's kind of hurts my heart to have to go over the Civil War, but I know how important it was, and of course what it led to in that midst of making all men free in the United States.